Censorship of opinions and comments is becoming increasingly challenging for publishers and platforms in the time of COVID-19. No other world health emergency has attracted such enormous coverage, facts, misinformation, and outright nonsense. And the concurrent rise of social media as an information source has helped the spread of important public health information, but also the inaccurate and sometimes dangerous misinformation. Censorship on the major media platforms, Facebook, Twitter and YouTube, is not new. These companies regularly remove content that they consider objectionable based on their company policies. This includes hate speech, the glorification of violence, harmful, dangerous and inaccurate content. These categories are often broader than the exceptions to freedom of speech provisions entrenched in legislation of democratic governments. Often the definitions are vague and leave plenty of room for admin interpretation. Administrators, after all, are just human. Moderation, the polite word for censorship, can also be politically biased. Most of these platforms are privately owned companies. Your decision to opt in or out will take into account the political leanings, either real or perceived, of the platforms. That decision, the comments you make and the information you share, is yours. Some high-profile examples of moderation with apparent political bias include Twitter's labelling of some of US President Donald Trump's tweets as violating Twitter's policy about glorifying violence or abusive behaviour. They also added warnings to some tweets suggesting that posts were factually inaccurate. But as private companies, they can and do retain the right to what content they tolerate or don't tolerate. But surely censorship on Facebook, Twitter or YouTube from the get-go appears to contradict the very idea of these networks, spaces where everyone gets to express their own opinion. It states on YouTube that its mission is to give everyone a voice. Twitter once described itself as the free speech wing of the Free Speech Party. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg always repeats Facebook's commitment to the freedom of speech. Plenty of people flock to these platforms to share their views and thoughts, and lots of food pics too. They probably didn't expect biased censorship or any censorship on the platforms. So have the social media platforms deceived you? How about the publishers and their comment sections? Again, news publishers have to make the daily decisions on what to publish and what not to publish. This human intervention on what gets onto the front page or what gets published at all is also a long list of human decisions. Words carefully chosen or omissions made to suit the writer's personal bias, or heaven forbid, the bias of the owners. Bias and moderation are part of the publishing landscape and have been for 100 years. Currently, a handful of big tech companies dominate the world's social media, a lot of it which serves as a source of news for their users. 36% of 24,000 respondents from 12 countries use Facebook for news weekly. 21% of those surveyed use YouTube as their news source. Add to that Google and its preeminence as the search engine of choice, and it becomes clear that a very few tech companies have huge leverage over what information people using the internet get to see and how their views are shaped. So these tech giants' role to mould and shape public discourse becomes apparent, and the misuse of this power has had profound effects on a number of important elections and votes around the world in the past 5 years. As an example, just Google the story of the private micro-targeting firm Cambridge Analytica and its gaming of the 2016 Brexit vote. As a pushback, governments are either attempting to find solutions to these issues or looking to censor the censors, limiting the content and moderation of social media platforms. Now, Mark Zuckerberg, when coming up with the Facebook platform, apparently was more interested in finding an easy way to find a girlfriend than to manipulate voter trends and rig the Brexit vote. He certainly wouldn't have imagined his platform would be used to spread misinformation about a pandemic. But here we are. In response to calls to combat misinformation about COVID-19, a group of social media companies, including Facebook, Twitter and YouTube, issued a joint statement last year. The statement said they're jointly combating fraud and misinformation about the virus, elevating authoritative content on their platforms. The world's publishers, too, have had to quickly sort through their sources and decide how and what to report in terms of the growing pandemic. The problem with the rise and popularity of social media is that the amount of disinformation being spread was often overpowering the real information from reliable and responsible sources. All publishers, as private businesses or publicly traded companies, have the responsibility to report the news. Of course, some choose to twist that responsibility to political gain. Happens around the world. Indeed, Rupert Murdoch, the founder of Fox News, made a clever financial decision to deliver conservative biased news to a conservative audience, locking in viewers for the fledgling cable network from one side of the political spectrum. Rupert Murdoch has owned and published other conservative-leaning media in the past, principally in the UK and Australia. But this boardroom decision for publishers to take on a particular political bias continues to shape the news landscape as more disenfranchised readers move to the newer, nimble, seemingly freer-speaking social media platforms. Then, of course, some governments have their own attitude towards freedom of speech that needs to be taken into account by publishers working in those domains. Southeast Asia doesn't have a very good record when it comes to freedom of speech. Singapore, for example, has one of the most draconian attitudes towards censorship in the region, scoring poorly for decades in the annual World Freedom of Speech Index. Thailand, whilst it has its own media taboos, has a much more vigorous political media. Malaysia, Indonesia, Myanmar, the Philippines, they've all got their local layers of political censorship that change with the change of governments. Social media platforms provide a new challenge to governments that try and restrict the views being expressed by their citizens, and that's probably a good thing. As a publisher and curator of published content, it's a responsibility we take on with great seriousness. Whilst valuing freedom of speech, there also has to be a clear distinction between facts and outright nonsense. That distinction can sometimes be difficult in an age where so much information is peddled around the internet as fact, but every publisher has to make that decision every hour, every day. For publishers and those that also post on the social media platforms, the biggest challenge is the engagement with an audience that 20 years ago were just silent consumers of the published content. The publishers are not only responsible for what they publish in the first place, but now also the content of the comments section on their own platforms and the social media platforms they use. First and foremost, publishers have to protect their business. So the deletion or moderation of comments and posts is a responsibility that has become, in some cases, a full-time job. Publishers are mostly private companies or run by boards answerable to shareholders. We all have to be careful about not only what we publish, but the content across our platforms, all the content. On Facebook, Twitter and YouTube, the owners of the platforms will sometimes filter out some comments before they even reach the publisher's comments section. Then publishers have the responsibility to curate the remaining content. It's less a challenge to the pretext of freedom of speech and more a matter of running a responsible, profitable business. All publishers will come up with their own attitude towards what they will tolerate, what they choose to publish, and their own rules about what is permissible and what's not. That is their responsibility as it's their platform. At the end of the day, you still retain the full power to comment or not to comment on any particular forum. And the publisher retains the right to remove your comment if they deem it against their best interests, political or financial. The future of publishing and media will continue to be a two-way discourse, disrupted forever by social media. Publishers, social media platform owners and users will all need to find ways to keep enjoying that discourse in the brave new world.